Pilgrims and Native Americans are the heart of Thanksgiving lore in America, and nothing is more synonymous with this sentiment than the voyage of the Mayflower. The story of survival, a new future, and hope for a better life along with the dangers of the voyage and the hardships of a new settlement have fascinated and baffled Americans for generations, including a young and impressionable Eleanor. Welcome to Shipwreck Sunday. My name is Eleanor. Just a quick disclaimer for a younger audience before we dive in. This story may be disturbing to some, so viewer discretion is advised. Okay everyone, let's get into it. For those who celebrate, happy Thanksgiving. For all of you who don't, happy dinner. Eat something yummy today. This video will pair perfectly with stuffing, turkey, and mashed potatoes, so I hope you brought your plate. Let me know what you're eating today as we get into the journey of the Mayflower in 1620. There were 26 ships named the Mayflower in the 1600s during the reign of James I, and we don't know why the name was so popular. However, Captain Christopher Jones's Mayflower and its incredible voyage has become an enormous pop culture icon in the United States. American school children learned this very early on, and I remember learning about it in the second grade in elementary school. For those unfamiliar with the American school system, I was 6 and 7 years old during the school year from 2005 to 2006. For some of you, that makes me very young, and for others, that makes me very old. Anyways, let's look at something thankfully older than myself, the Mayflower. She was a Dutch cargo flute with her tonnage sitting at 180 plus tons, though we don't know exactly. She was between 80 and 90 feet long on deck and between 100 and 110 feet long overall. She was roughly 25 feet wide at the beam, and we know she had about 4 decks. We have no idea what her capacity was rated at, but we know she carried about 135 people to the Plymouth colony. Her maiden voyage was before 1609, and she was out of service sometime between 1622 and 1624, though we don't know what exactly happened to her. Some rumors are that her timbers were used for a still extant barn at Jordan's Village in Buckinghamshire, but we really don't know. But Eleanor, why did the Mayflower journey to America? Great question that you totally asked without my coaching. Well, my friend, a congregation of around 400 English Protestants were living in exile in Leiden, Holland, and were dissatisfied with the failure of the Church of England to reform what they felt were many excesses and abuses. And yes, it is that Church of England created by King Henry VIII so he could get a divorce and marry Anne Boleyn. Rather than work for change like other Puritans, they decided to live like separatists.
Roger, roger.
In religiously intolerant Holland in 1608. As separatists, they were considered illegal radicals by their home country of England. That could result in a lot of different fates, most of them horrifying. Unfortunately, life in Holland became increasingly difficult for the congregation, being forced into menial, backbreaking jobs which led to a variety of health conditions. Political unrest and the fear that Spain might once more place Holland's population under siege only added to the increasingly unlivable situations. The separatists began to dream of the New World, which had been unveiled to Europeans by Christopher Columbus in 1492. Their hearts lie in the New World now, and their desire to travel to America was seen as audacious and risky, since previous attempts to settle in America had already failed. Jamestown in Virginia, founded in 1607, had seen most of its settlers die within the first year. 440 of the 500 new arrivals had starved to death during the first 6 months of winter. Not only this, but there was the threat of scared indigenous folks attacking what they did not know. Despite all of these factors, the separatists believed heartily that God wanted them to go, later writing, quote, "We verily believe and trust the Lord is with us, and that he will graciously prosper our endeavors, according to the simplicity of our hearts therein." The Pilgrims had the motivation, and next they needed a plan. If you're enjoying this video, make sure to subscribe for more content like this. Want to live like Eleanor? Visit our Amazon storefront in the description of this episode to see our favorite shipwreck essentials and help support the channel. Okay, let's get into the incredible voyage that lie ahead of these pilgrims. Okay, we've got the chutzpah to cross the Atlantic in the 1620s. Now we need a plan. It took weeks upon weeks to cross the Atlantic back in these days, not a mere few days like it would have been even on Titanic in 1912. That means lots of provisions, and most importantly, we need to procure some ships. The decision was made, we're leaving Holland. So they planned to cross the Atlantic in 2 purchased ships. A small ship named Speedwell would first carry them from Leyden to England. Then the larger and more famous Mayflower would carry the pilgrims to America. Not all of the congregation were able to go. Some weren't able to settle their affairs, and others didn't have the budget to purchase enough supplies for the journey. Therefore, the congregation decided to send the younger and stronger members first, with others possibly following later on. Though the congregation was led by John Robinson, and he was the one who proposed the idea of moving to America, he chose to remain in Leyden to care for those who could not make the journey. When it was finally time to leave, it was incredibly emotional for everyone. According to the ship's senior leader, Edward Winslow, the scene was described as, quote, "A flood of tears was poured out. Those not sailing accompanied us to the ship, but were not able to speak to one another for the abundance of sorrow before parting." William Bradford, another leader who would be the second governor of the Plymouth colony, similarly described the departure, stating, quote, "Truly doleful was the sight of that sad and mournful parting, to see what sighs and sobs and prayers did sound among them, what tears did gush from every eye, and pity speeches pierced each heart, their reverend pastor falling down on his knees, and they all with him." After this gut-wrenching goodbye, the trip to Southampton took 3 days, and they anchored in Southampton on August 5th, 1620. From there, the pilgrims took in the sight of the Mayflower as she was loaded with provisions, and she'd be their home for the next coming weeks. On the way down to England, Speedwell had sprung a leak and had to be repaired. On August 5th, 1620, Mayflower and Speedwell departed for America, and unfortunately, Speedwell suffered yet another leak, needing both ships to return to Dartmouth for repairs. They departed yet again after these repairs, hoping for a successful voyage. Third time is the charm, right? Wrong. Speedwell sprung a third leak, and the pilgrims had no choice but to abandon the unreliable Speedwell and make determination on her passengers. This was a dire event, as vital funds had been wasted on Speedwell, which were considered very important to the future success of their settlement in America. Both ships returned to Plymouth, where 20 Speedwell passengers joined the now overcrowded Mayflower, and the rest returned to Holland, shoulders slouched in disappointment. As if we haven't run into enough roadblocks, now they waited for the wind to pick up, waiting a grueling 7 days. This was important, as it would eat into their provisions. William Bradford worried, writing, quote, "We lie here waiting for as fair a wind as can blow. Our victuals will be half eaten up, I think, before we go from the coast of England, and if our voyage lasts long, we shall not have a month's victuals when we come in the country." According to Bradford, Speedwell was refitted and seaworthy at this point, having, quote, "made many voyages to the great profit of her owners." He suggested foul play, possibly that Speedwell's captain may have used, quote, "cunning and deceit to abort the voyage by causing the leaks, fearing starvation and death in America." Honestly, valid concerns here. Not like there's going to be a big, beautiful Thanksgiving dinner when they land. For those having Thanksgiving dinner or having had dinner already, what's your favorite part of it? Mine is either mashed potatoes or pie. Finally, after an agonizing week, the Mayflower could set sail. In early September of 1620, western gales turned the North Atlantic into a dangerous place to sail. Bradford is spot on at this point, because the provisions were already quite low when they left Southampton, and became even slimmer by delays of more than a month. The passengers had been living on the ship full time, already feeling worn out and in no condition for a taxing, lengthy, and possibly life-threatening transatlantic crossing cooped up in the cramped, hot, and dank spaces of a small ship. Remember, this is also before indoor plumbing or regular bathing, so it smelled to high heaven and was utterly filthy as well. I'll get more into the conditions of it later, and it's horrifying. When Mayflower sailed from Plymouth alone on September 16, 1620, she carried 102 passengers and a crew of 25 to 30 men, rounding up to about 130 on board. She was a considerably smaller cargo ship than they probably needed, having traveled mainly between England and Bordeaux with clothing and wine, definitely not across the ocean. Not only was she not an ocean ship, but she wasn't even in good condition at this point. She was evidently sold for scrap between 2 and 4 years after her voyage, and allegedly some of that scrap became that barn at Jordan's Village. She was a high-built craft forward and aft, much like a carrack. They were finally at sea, and we are finally thanking you, wonderful people. Thank you so much to our amazing YouTube members and patrons. If you'd like to have some awesome perks like episodes a full day in advance, join our YouTube memberships today. Alright, let's look at the conditions of this harrowing voyage. For the 102 passengers, conditions were very cramped, with the living area being only 20 by 80 feet and the ceiling about 5 feet high. Unless you're Sabrina Carpenter, you're not standing up comfortably on the Mayflower. Couples and children were packed closely together for a trip lasting a grand total of 2 months, so there was a great deal of trust and confidence required among everyone on board. John Carver, one of the leaders on board, instilled much inspiration and divine purpose within the pilgrims, leading them to believe they, quote, had a covenant like the Jewish people of old. Despite this grandeur and divine purpose, it really did not change the terrible conditions aboard the ship. The first half of the voyage proceeded over calm seas and under pleasant skies. Then, the weather soured, with continuous northeasterly storms hitting the ship and huge waves constantly crashing into the top deck. In the midst of one storm, William Button, the young indentured servant of physician Samuel Fuller, perished. He was miraculously the only fatality of this voyage, and he was buried at sea. A baby was also born on the voyage, christened Oceanus Hopkins. This wasn't the end of the drama, however, as during one storm, one so bad that the sails could not be used, the ship was forced to drift for days or risk losing her masts. The storm washed passenger John Holland overboard, and he sank about 12 feet, but a crew member threw a rope which Holland somehow got a hold of, and they pulled him back on board, no worse for wear. Being the ceilings were so low and lighting so poor, passengers were forced to crouch in semi-darkness below deck. With waves tossing the ship in different directions, men held onto their wives, who in turn clutched their children close. Water soaked everyone and everything above and below decks. This would cause other issues that I learned in 2nd grade and horrified me so much it has stuck with me for almost 20 years. I'm going to share that with you now so you can also be equally traumatized. You're welcome in advance. For everyone eating their Thanksgiving dinner right now while watching this video, I implore you to skip this section titled Gross in the chapters. Because I love you, I don't want to ruin your dinner. For everyone else, get ready because it's nasty. This information is 20 years old, so keep that in mind. But my 2nd grade teacher told me the pilgrims used to eat their food in the dark. I was perplexed at the young age of 6. Why would they do that? Well, they were at sea for so long, and the damp, nasty conditions were a perfect breeding ground for pests. Think rats, mice, cockroaches, weevils, and other creepy crawlies. They did not want to see what was possibly crawling around in their food as they crunched and munched on it, and so they ate in darkness, forcing themselves to eat what food they had left, no matter how infested by pests or spoiled it was. I also heard that they covered their food in inordinate amounts of salt in an attempt to preserve it. Again, take this with a grain of that salt I just mentioned because I learned this so long ago, but it's horrified me for 20 years, so I had to get this off my chest. Welcome back everyone who skipped that gross chapter, and for everyone else, I'm so sorry for the trauma that we now share. In mid-ocean, Mayflower came close to being totally disabled and might have had to return to England or risk sinking. A storm had so badly damaged its main beam that even the sailors despaired. By a stroke of pure luck or perhaps divine intervention, one of the colonists had a metal jack screw that he'd purchased in Holland to aid in the construction of the new settler homes. A jack screw is a type of jack that is operated by turning a lead screw. They used it in order to secure the beam, which kept it from cracking further, and thus protecting the seaworthiness of the ship. In the ship's cargo hold were many essentials the pilgrims would need, including but not limited to tools, food, and weapons, as well as some live animals like dogs, sheep, goats, and poultry. The ship also held 2 small 21-foot boats powered by oars or sails. There were also artillery pieces aboard, which they might need to defend themselves against enemy European forces or indigenous tribes. After 2 long, arduous months at sea, the pilgrims sighted present-day Cape Cod on November 19, 1620. They spent several more days at sea trying to sail south to their planned destination of the colony of Virginia, where they'd been given permission to settle from the Company of Merchant Adventurers. However, the strong winter seas forced them to return to the harbor at Cape Cod Hook, now known as Provincetown Harbor, and they set anchor on November 21st. Before settling anchor, the male pilgrims and non-pilgrim passengers drew up and signed the Mayflower Compact. This was to establish basic law and order and to stifle strife within the ranks. Miles Standish was selected to make sure the rules were obeyed, as there was a consensus that discipline would need to be enforced to ensure the survival of the colony. Once everything was settled, they came ashore so that they could settle. On Monday, December 7, 1620, an exploring expedition launched under the direction of Captain Christopher Jones to search for a suitable settlement site. There were 24 passengers and 10 sailors on this expedition, and they were badly prepared. Winters in North America are much colder than in Europe, and our summers are hotter, so the Pilgrims were ill-prepared. They were forced to spend the night on shore because of the bad weather they encountered, ill-clad in below-freezing temperatures in wet shoes and stockings that froze overnight. Some died that night. Plymouth faced many challenges in their first winter, including the risk of starvation and the lack of suitable shelter. They had no way of knowing that the ground would be frozen solid by the middle of November, making it impossible to do any farming. They also were not ready for the snowstorms that would make the countryside impassable without snowshoes. And in their haste to leave, they didn't bring any fishing rods. From the very beginning, the natives of North America and the help they provided were vital. The natives were accustomed to this way of life and helped them find corn, beans, and seeds for planting in the spring. During the winter, the passengers remained on board the Mayflower as much as they could, suffering an outbreak of a contagious disease described as a mixture of scurvy, pneumonia, and tuberculosis. After it was over, only 53 passengers of the 102 that had crossed the Atlantic survived. Half of the ship's crew had died as well. In the spring, they built huts ashore, and the passengers finally disembarked from the Mayflower on March 31, 1621. Jones had originally planned to return to England as soon as the Pilgrims were settled. However, his crew were so sick that they had to stay until they were well again. They set sail for England on April 15, 1621. Since so many sailors had died from disease, Captain Jones had lost his boatswain, his gunner, 3 quartermasters, the cook, and more than a dozen sailors. Jones and his skeleton crew made excellent time across the pond, and the Mayflower arrived in London on May 16, 1621, in less than half the time it took for the voyage to America. The ship would then be scrapped and allegedly partially made into a barn, which is now privately owned. Again, it's difficult to confirm if this barn was actually made from the Mayflower, but we do know that her legacy has lasted centuries, even if her timbers have not. Timbers crackling with fire in a fireplace to cook a warm stew was a welcome sight for the Pilgrims. But fire is not always a welcome sight. In April of 1991, an Italian ro-ro ferry was engulfed in flames, lashing at the hull and threatening the lives of everyone on board, quickly becoming a massive emergency. Fires on ships, despite how ironic it seems, are a common occurrence, and tomorrow on Fast Facts Friday, we explore the dangers of ship fires.